We can just get started. Yeah. Okay, so today our topic is inventory management presented by Peter Versfeld, Manager of Risk Advisory at Deloitte Canada. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. Please start whenever you're ready.
Sorry, I just want to get to the right slide. So hopefully with the session today, we can give you a useful framework to approach some of the challenges in a systematic manner, and hopefully kind of help you manage your inventory in your respective businesses. The inventory management, you might wonder why this is important, but it's kind of important from the perspective where if you have money to spend, there's various things that you can do. You could either reduce your loan balances, you can look at expanding the business, you can save the money, you could hire more employees, or you could buy more inventory. And kind of part of that discussion why inventory management becomes important, there's a whole aspect around identifying current demand in the market, linking that through to how much inventory I should be carrying in order to be able to meet the demands and the needs of my customers. So throughout this presentation, I'll make reference to the word strategies throughout. So when I say the word strategy, it could be as simple or as complex as you'd want it to be. Simply for me, a strategy is a decision made on how the business will operate based on research conducted and documented. So the key takeaway from a strategy document is looking at researching a specific topic, saying, so for inventory, for example, how often do you want to do inventory counts? It's doing research and understanding what's kind of done typically and what would work for your business, and then actually just documenting that information in a document to know the decision that was made. So when I'm saying strategy, I'm not expecting, I don't necessarily mean a 100-page document. It could be a 5-page, it could be an email, it could be a couple of notes. It's just about the key things, just capturing those key decisions that are made in a specific document. So moving on, sorry. So kind of what we'll be covering today, we'll be focusing on the importance of optimizing inventory management, looking at some best practices, and then also looking at other considerations. So kicking off on optimizing inventory management and around why it's important. The key thing to understand, the key reason why this is important, depending on the nature of your business, inventory could be a big cost to you. Whether this be through the fact that if you're doing manufacturing, you could have specific products that are very unique and very expensive to obtain. And again, going back to the first comment around if you have money to spend, if you don't need to be buying inventory, you could be reducing loan balances. So that's why it's critical to manage inventory appropriately. So for many businesses in the retail, manufacturing, and even in the service sector, it tends to be a significant recurring cost. And that's why it's also important to understand how inventory maps or affects your business, and kind of like in certain businesses, they might have a bigger impact than others. The second reason why it's important is the risk of spoilage. So the inventory only has value if customers are willing to buy it, or it can be used in production. So who often has gone to the grocery store and found an avocado, and you find that it's either too green or overripe, and then decided not to buy it? So depending on the nature of the inventory, that could also be an impact as part of the inventory management. So obviously, certain things don't have expiry dates, while certain items do, and then others even have expiry dates that are covered through regulation. So, for example, medication, and I think baby formula is the two that come to mind. Um, so another one is also the obsolescence. So whether change in technology, whether this be through just the internet, through competition, through different production methods, there's always the risk that the technology becomes obsolete. I mean, if you think back 10 years ago, the BlackBerry was the phone to have, and today BlackBerry doesn't exist. So there are certain things where technology just catches up, and you always have to be aware of the trends to make sure that doesn't become obsolete. And just touching back again on the impact of purchasing inventory, it impacts short-term liquidity. So basically, if you buy too much inventory too soon, you tie up too much cash, where there's a potential of tying up too much cash in inventory than that's needed. And if you buy too little, you run into the problem of not being able to meet demand and satisfying customers. The next slide. Oops. So maybe the key thing to where a lot of this will tie together is understanding challenges in inventory management. So some of the issues revolve around understanding demand. So when I speak about inventory management, it's more than just how much, it's more than just what am I buying. It's also understanding how much, and all the way through from understanding demand in the market, understanding customers, understanding that need and what I need to buy and produce at the end of the day. I think it's natural for everyone to want to believe in their own products, because I feel if you don't believe in your own product, you shouldn't be selling it. But it's also important to recognize what the market is saying and respond accordingly. Sometimes you're it's just mindful of making sure that the passion for your products don't interfere with sound judgment around demand trends. So for example, I know there was a few years ago where organic foods is a big thing, for example. So if you didn't have organic food, then people actually would stop buying your products and stuff like that. So it's just understanding where the demand trend is. It's not trying to keep up with fads necessarily, but it's just be mindful that depending on what the current market demand is, that your products could be impacted by that. Another challenge is the monitoring of inventory levels. So your inventory can fluctuate many times a day, and then it's just important, and it can become very difficult and time consuming to manage these levels. If you are fortunate enough to have like a retail system, a point of sale system that automatically adjusts the inventory levels, then that's easy. But for a lot of businesses, they might not have that, and then it's often a manual process about going back and adjusting, or at the end of the day, updating, adjusting the systems accordingly. So the challenge can be overcome by implementing sound inventory management systems and practices. Some additional challenges around monitoring inventory levels, or sort of combined with everything, is actually having the available storage. So maybe you have limited space. So ordering 500 units of a product might not make sense. Even though if you need it, it's maybe, would there be a way where you could order them in batches to be able to maintain the storage? The third one is about safeguarding inventory. Depending on the nature of the inventory, there's a risk of theft and misappropriation, whether it's internal or external. Obviously, certain products are more at risk than others. So electronics typically is a very high risk item, just because of the ability to convert it to cash. So you can go to someone can just take it and go to a pawn shop and convert that. The last challenge is around vendor relationship management. So even for smaller businesses, this is something to always consider from the perspective that even though you're a smaller business, it's about finding finding relationships with vendors that can ensure timely delivery, accurate delivery, so it's the right types and quantities of inventory. Make sure that the quality is appropriate, and also when you referenced, and then also around payments. So do you have to pay a significant deposit upfront before the inventory even arrives, or are you able to arrange 30-day or 60-day payment terms? And again, that's where going from inventory management that feeds into cash flow management, where if I buy too much right now, I'm going to tie up all my cash in that inventory, meaning I might not be able to pay other expenses. Um, Another impact through vendor relationships too, or consideration through this too, is for a lot of customers that had where most of the products or most of the vendors were foreign vendors, they had issues during COVID, for example, where some of the factories in China that weren't operating, they were unable to obtain the inventory. So it's always important to consider the vendor relationship too, from whether it's local or a foreign perspective. Whether that can also be a business decision, in that the current demand is to support local businesses. So if you have local vendors, then you can also meet that demand from customers for locally produced products. But also then you have a protection from the fact that if something like COVID were to happen, then you would have safety in production because it's all done locally. Moving on to the next one. Actually, I think I'm going to stop there. Is there any questions before we kind of run into the next section? Feel free to just use the chat box. I don't see anyone right now, but feel free to just pop them in there as we go along. So I'm going to say this is probably the least favorite topic for everyone, because everyone always sees IT as the big person with a beard in the corner sitting there, just where you go to when your computer has a problem. But it's just important to understand the role or the impact that IT has in not just inventory management, but in your business as a whole. It's from looking at it from the perspective that even if it's just to understand what's the impact on my business, whether it's positive or negative. One of the favorite examples that they always have is before the big kickoff of digital cameras, Kodak actually developed digital cameras before everyone else did, but they ended up not wanting to cannibalize on their print photography. They never, pushed digital photography as much as they did the print photography, and that's why they ended up going bankrupt, was because they just didn't know that the market was driving them towards that. So it's important to just understand the impact that IT has on your business. So for a lot of the misconception often is that you're having an enterprise resource management system is only for your big companies. So I want to tell you that that's a myth. There's a lot of systems that are tailored for small and medium-sized enterprises, and a lot of the time you can make it as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. I mean, if you have this number of employees working in the same office, then maybe it's sufficient just to have a small basic system. However, as soon as you have a number of offices throughout the city or in a different province, then maybe having a bit more of a complex system makes sense. The reports from these systems can help you maintain strong internal controls over inventory management. So they can help you manage things like knowing when you need to reorder your stock, knowing when you potentially making sure that you have the appropriate approvals in place for when the stock is ordered all the way through to when the stock is delivered. And then also you can have key performance indicators built into the system. So basically what that means is that we'll touch a bit on this later as well, but if your vendors continuously delivers your products late, maybe if there's a way that you can track that and say these vendors deliver within 10 days, but these vendors deliver within 8, consistently, maybe then we can go with different vendors depending on how they perform. Moving on to the next one. So now I was going to briefly touch on sort of best practices around inventory management, or around procurement specifically. So, I mean, it's the same reason why if you were to go to Costco versus going to a smaller grocery chain, the bulk versus smaller quantities would kind of determine whether you buy. It typically is a bigger discount involved when you buy in bulk. So if you go to a specific company or a specific vendor, and you ask them, say, but I'd like to order in bulk versus ordering small quantities the whole time. But again, knowing whether you can buy in bulk will be determined by, can I tie up my cash in my inventory for that long, depending on how long your turnover is for those items. So that's why I said it's a whole process to understand what is my demand, what inventory do I need, and at what price do I need it for my customers to buy that. So it's critical to understand that whole process from all the way through from the customer demand all the way through to buying the stock. The next one talks about timing of ordering and deliveries, and again, that's tying back to how a lot of the business models have changed from the point where they don't keep a lot of stock on hand, but they'll order it as needed because the delivery times for a lot of the stock is so short. So it means instead of having to invest a big amount of cash into specific inventory, you can just have it with the supplier. They would or you would just have you just have suppliers set up in such a way that they deliver to you within a very short time frame. You're able to produce your products and then deliver it within a few days. The next one is around determining the reorder points. So this will again be based on that customer demand. So if you have 100 items in stock, you know that in the next 5 days you'll sell 20. On average, you'll sell 20 a day. You need to know that you have to order stock within the 5 days, otherwise you're going to no longer have inventory. So it's just understanding, and again, it's about understanding what your demand is and looking at averages in terms of how often the turnover of the stock happens to understand when you would need to reorder the stock. And then tied with that too is also the demand forecasting. So a lot of goods and services will change depending on the season. I suspect that ice cream shops probably don't do very well in winter, so they will typically reduce hours, or they won't be open, or they'll potentially have a different business model that they'll follow in the winter. But then they will compensate that by having a completely different setup in the summer. So they might have longer hours, they might have different things. And again, like I said, the demand by the customers will drive that decisioning process. So it's the demand that determines when I should be selling, for how much I should be selling. The next one to consider is about customer fulfillment strategies. So you could have strategically located distribution centers. So as an example, Amazon has a number of distribution centers located throughout Canada. So if you were to order something from Amazon, even though you're ordering from Amazon on these products, some of them take longer to arrive, but a lot of the ones that you receive within a day or two are typically located at these distribution centers. So instead of having to ship something from Ontario, they can have it shipped from Calgary or Edmonton, which means it reduces the delivery time. Another one to think about is also where the suppliers deliver directly to customers. So in essence, you're kind of like the middleman between them. So you could take in the orders and then you place the order with the supplier will deliver the goods to the customer. Next one. So the next one, again, we've kind of touched on this briefly, but this one talks about the vendor management. So a lot of companies were very negatively impacted by having a lot of foreign suppliers, especially the ones in China, where they were quite negatively impacted because the factories were all shut down. So they struggled to be able to get goods and supplies for their businesses. And therefore, in cases like that, it might also be beneficial to have local suppliers versus foreign ones. Ideally, and this is the risk manager in me talking, but ideally you would want to balance between the two, where typically what's happened is the reason why a lot of businesses use foreign suppliers is because they're cheaper and they're able to design them to specific specifications for a lower price. And they tend to deliver them faster, even though they're foreign. But again, if it's a business decision that was made to support local businesses, that could also be a selling point of your inventory or of your goods and service. But again, that's a business decision that's made to decide whether you want to support only local businesses or not. And that's where the drive behind broadly Canadian or Canadian owned businesses are that's a big drive behind that. So again, tying in with vendor management is around negotiating favorable terms. So favorable terms could be both from a cost perspective, but the one thing to not discount is even if you order from a company and they don't necessarily give you a discount, but if you're able to negotiate a favorable payment term, so instead of having to pay them when they deliver the goods, but maybe you can have typically 30 or 60 days is, if you're lucky, 60, but typically 30 days payment is as far as a lot of them would be able to go. So that helps you be able to manage your cash flow as part of the process so that you don't lock down all your cash in inventory. So even though you might not be able to get a discount from vendors, it might still be good to consider negotiating terms because potentially you could get benefits through through payment terms or even through interest rates. So even though maybe they say, well, if you don't pay within 30 days, we're going to charge you interest. But if it's a small percentage, it might be worth it instead of locking up all your cash in your inventory. And then again, tracking vendor performance. So what that could be around, like we mentioned, around the quality, the accuracy, and the timeliness of deliveries. So it's important to track the vendors to make sure that they're delivering quality products. Because if they're not delivering quality, that impacts your ability to deliver quality products. So it's important to know which vendors to use and which ones not to use because it impacts your business as well. So the next one speaks to contingency planning. So I'm pretty sure a worldwide pandemic was not included on the risk assessment for a lot of businesses, but that might be a consideration going forward. But a risk assessment, in essence, is looking at the inventory cycle and understanding whether you're using local or foreign suppliers and understanding the whole structure of the inventory cycle from the perspective of what can go wrong. So saying, for example, if it's a local supplier, what can go wrong? If you're using foreign suppliers, what could go wrong? So for example, with a foreign supplier is that they could be delivering inferior products, delayed delivery, etc. And then kind of what we call implementing measures to address risks is in essence controls. So kind of saying, well, what could we do to make sure that they don't deliver inferior products? So as an example, if you negotiate terms with these foreign suppliers, you could have a contract that says, well, if you deliver bad stuff, we're going to send it back to you and it's going to be at your cost. Moving on to the next one. Oops. So again, talking a bit about the controls. So purchasing controls would include, again, this kind of links strongly to the vendor management piece too. So it's around the vendor selection and approval. So sometimes there are vendors that you maybe don't want to be associated with, whether this be a perfect example right now is you probably wouldn't want to be, you would probably not want to be one of the WE charities vendors, just because of the whole thing that's surrounding it at the moment, the whole controversy. So it's important to understand which vendors you're using and whether you want to be affiliated, whether you want to or not, with those specific vendors. That's what's important, to have at least a list of vendors that you typically use, and then have them approved. I mean, you can't have a vendor for every little situation. Sometimes you're going to have vendors that you use as once-offs, but a good benchmark is probably, once you've used a vendor at least 5 times, then you probably should consider looking at like doing an approval and just understanding, like, do I want to be associated with this vendor? Is there a way that I could negotiate some terms with them about payment, or about whether it's payment or other favorable terms? So when we talk about purchase orders, the purpose of this is, again, for most businesses, it might not make sense depending on the size of the operation. But if you have different offices ordering inventory, it might be beneficial to have a purchase order system. So what you would have is, you would have someone requesting, saying that we've reached a certain threshold, we need to order more inventory. So they complete the purchase order. That purchase order is provided to a manager for review, or the business owner, depending. And that just gives the business, you as the business owner, that oversight of, are we maybe ordering too much, or are we ordering the right level of stuff? Are we ordering the right stuff? Are we ordering it from the wrong kind of vendor? And then once we speak to the delivery, the receiving controls further down, you'll also match the purchase order to the goods received, to make sure that what you've actually ordered and approved is actually what's delivered. So around the receiving controls to consider is the physical inspection. So, I mean, it's the same reason when you receive something from Amazon or through any delivery company, you want to make sure that it's in a working condition, and that it's working the way that it's supposed to. So it's always good to just inspect it and make sure that it's actually the thing that you've ordered is the first thing, making sure that it's in the right condition, that it's not broken, that it's not got damage, anything like that. Because the problem is, if you don't, I know certain vendors have limits on how soon you can return the item. So, for example, on Amazon, I think it's a 30-day return or a 14-day return, depending on the item that you've ordered. So it's always good to inspect it and return it sooner rather than later, just so that you can get your money back or a replacement. And then again, like I mentioned, around matching the POs with the items received, it's looking at that original purchase order that was placed, comparing that to what was received, to make sure that what you've actually ordered was actually the items received, from both a quantity perspective as well as the specific item. So maybe, did you order 10 and you received 5? Because that's also then, how much did you actually end up paying? Because if you paid for 10 but only received 5, that's kind of just important to note that as well. Next one. So one of the key controls as part of inventory management is inventory counts. So again, there's this kind of a strategy that you would have to develop for your business, depending on how big a component inventory forms of your business. So, for example, if you are in retail, I suspect that you would typically do a more continuous stock count, potentially daily, potentially weekly, even monthly, depending on the complexity of your system. But I mean, if you have larger value, slower moving stock, maybe quarterly or annually is sufficient. But again, this is also driven to some extent by the complexity of your system, where some inventory systems are able to track the changes as you go along, while others you have to do manual adjustments. So typically the ones for manual adjustments, you'd want to do more frequent counts, just from the perspective that you'd want to make sure that what's in the system is actually in stock, because a lot of your decisions will be made based on the system. So if there's a discrepancy there, you do want to follow up on that. So it's so also when it's important to consider the frequency and the extent of these counts, like I said, in the context of your business. So you typically want to focus on inventory items that are higher value, more key or strategic. So you could have certain inventory items that maybe take 6 months to deliver. So you want to make sure that, will I have enough items of that specific item for the next 6 months, should my delivery be delayed? So again, like I said, it's where that becomes critical to understand your customer demand or the market demand from that perspective, because you want to understand what the demand is, looking at what I have on hand and saying, do I have enough to survive until I'm able to order more? Um, so, and then also when inventory is also located at multiple locations, it's kind of might be a good thing to do the counts at the same time, depending on whether it's possible or not. Um, Another consideration would be to for inventory counts would be to do. You could consider doing either a full stock take each month, or you could potentially do a cycle count every few weeks. So, for example, let's say the first week of the month you count, let's say at a grocery store. So the first week of the month you count um, all the meat related, all the butchery products. The second week of the month you count the bakery. The third week of the month you count the fresh produce, and the fourth week of the month you count only the dry produce. So then each month you cycle through each one. So like at the end of the day, you still do a monthly count of each of all the stock. It's just you cycle them each week, because that just gives that better manages employee time, because then you don't need as many people for as long to do like a full stock count on one day, and it also allows you to keep the business open instead of just doing the count. So just kind of spreading the burden of time over a longer period. So the most important thing when it comes to inventory counts is to be systematic about the process. So what you'd want is you want to have a clearly documented process to say how you go about it, so that are easy to follow and understand, and that can be duplicated by anyone. Um, and it's also important to train the counters on what they're supposed to do and monitor and supervise them. So typically when we do an audit, when we do an inventory count as part of an audit engagement, the things we look for is we make sure that, first of all, that the store was closed. We make sure that the store was closed, and that no one had access to it. We make sure we look at items such as like when the people were signing like we look for things like that there was clear instructions given to everyone. We make sure that all the inventory was counted. We also look at things that when the people counted, that there was two signatures or two counters performing the count. Another thing that's also important is that whenever a discrepancy was noted, that there was also a reason given for the variances. So we will touch on the variances shortly, but it's important to understand, once you find a difference, what do you do? How do you fix it? So another thing that also helps is if the inventory is stored it makes it easier to count if it's stored more systematically and arranged appropriately. Also, with the inventory count sheets should be pre-numbered, or if you have an ERP system to generate the count, they often have count sheets that you can generate from there as well. Moving on to the next one. Oops. So this is the one that we want to touch on, is about resolving variances. So the whole purpose behind the inventory count is to make sure that our system is accurate, to make sure that if the system sees that there are 10 items of a specific one, that we actually have those 10 items in stock, because the system is typically where the decisions are made for a business. So if you want to look at in terms of managing sales and reorder quantities, if you have a system that you rely on, this is where the inventory accounts become very critical. Because if you have a discrepancy, you need to understand what happened. So you might have a scenario where the system has more than what's actually in stock. So this could be for a number of reasons. This could be that somebody never booked the inventory checkout slip to make sure that the inventory was actually removed, or it could be that someone took the item and just, it could be theft, or it could just be that they just didn't process it properly to have that item removed. You could also have a situation where you have more inventory than you actually have in the system. And that could be because you received goods, you received the inventory, but that hasn't been booked into the system. So it could just be a timing difference of when the documents get processed. So I think it's also just important to know what to do when you have these discrepancies. So once you have those discrepancies, the key thing to look at is to review any receiving and sales document close to the time of the count, because that typically will resolve the difference. Like I mentioned before, it could be a situation where you've received the inventory into the inventory yard, but it's just not been processed in the system. And again, it's important here to segregate the duty of the people counting and the person correcting. So you don't necessarily want the person that found the error to also correct it, just because that gives them the ability to take something, say it's a variance, and just correct it without anyone knowing about it. Again, it's not everything's about fraud or managing theft, but it's just a good control to have in place. Another key thing of inventory accounts is around it also helps to identify obsolete or slow moving items. So when you're doing a count in the office or in the yard or something, if it's covered in dust and it looks like it hasn't been moved, then the question comes up, but can this item still be sold, or is there a risk that this is potentially old and would need to be written off? So again, this is a bigger impact for some items, more for certain items than others. Some items, I mean, if it's a iron bar, probably not going to be a problem. But if it's I'm also going to say if it was an avocado, but that's probably not the right one to use. But if you have grocery items that have past the expiry dates, for example, it's important to know whether that item can actually be sold or not. And then the reason why it's good to identify these items is because then strategies can be implemented quickly to move such items. So it's kind of saying, well, what do we end up wanting to do with this? Do we want to sell this, or potentially we could find a different kind of buyer for it? So we might not be able to sell it as we do in normal products, but maybe we can sell it as part of selling it to another supplier because they could use it in their production cycle, as an example. So it also improves record keeping from the perspective that you aren't carrying stock or inventory that's old on the books anymore. So it helps from that, keeping the records clean as well. Was there any questions on any of the best practices that we spoke about or touched on? Sure. Like I said, I'll still stop at the end for some questions as well, but feel free to just drop them in the chat box as we go along. So the last section isn't going to be too long. It's just going to, again, it's going to just touch on some other considerations around the vendors and the suppliers. So I know we've spoken about negotiating favorable terms with vendors. So typically what you'd want to do is, if you negotiate longer term agreements with them, then they typically tend to give you better rates. So if you say for the next 2 years, 3 years, I will only buy this kind of product from you, they will often give you whether, like I said, potentially you could get a discount on these products. Alternatively, a lot of them could be able to give you favorable payment terms. So you could maybe negotiate and say, well, we want to only pay it after 30 days. So that gives you that ability to kind of just manage your cash flow. And I know cash flow management is not part of this discussion, but that's why inventory management is so critical to this, is because it impacts that ability to have cash on hand. And I said, it's going to be critical for any of these recurring or frequent purchases, because that's where you're going to see the most benefit. Because, I mean, if there's a product that you buy once a year, the effort of developing long-term contracts with suppliers or negotiating, going through the effort of developing these agreements might not be as beneficial. But if you have a contract or agreement in place for recurring or frequent purchases, you typically see a much greater benefit. Because if you can get a 5% discount on something that you buy every day, then that can have a significant impact on your business. The next one is around consignment stock. So basically how this works is you have a supplier that says, we don't sell you the inventory, but you can keep it in your stores and you just pay us whatever you sell. Typically, suppliers don't want to do this because they technically carry the risk around obsolescence and stuff like that. But some vendors are willing to do this. So you could consider this as part of the contract negotiation. So what will happen is they will deliver a certain amount of inventory to the premises and say, here's 100 boxes. At the end of the month, they'll come by and count how many is left. So they'll say, well, there's 80 left. And then they will just ask you to pay for the 20 difference. If that makes sense. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask. But so that's basically how the consignment stock would work. So it's the inventory stays their property, but it's on your premises, and you don't pay for any inventory with the exception of what you've used. The last one is around supplier portals. A lot of suppliers have used or have started embracing sort of the Internet of Things for developing these portals where you can log in and place a specific ordering. You can just place orders and also track the orders and see what you want. Some of them have even gotten so complex where you can even see the specific products and pictures, kind of like how Amazon is, but just for suppliers. So it also enhances the communication and also kind of, I think, to some extent gives the people ordering the goods kind of a bit more power back too. So yeah, I don't know if there was any questions that anyone had. Because I think that's the end of the session. Is there any? Okay, I see lots of people are typing, so I'll just wait for the questions to come through. Okay, so the first one is, what alternative plan can be put in place to have control over supply when your product is solely dependent on a single raw material? I think in that situation, it would depend. So, and what I mean by it depends is it depends on whether you're able to obtain that single raw material from one vendor or a different number of vendors. So if there's only one vendor that supplies that, that might be a bit more difficult because they typically have control of the market. So it's difficult to get favorable terms negotiated. But if you have number of vendors that you can reach out to that has that raw material, I would consider, I think the key thing for me would be having a vendor contract in place, and then even doing an RFP, like a lot of companies sometimes do, like I don't want to say like a request for proposal, but even in a way looking at the different vendors and saying which ones you actually want to be associated with, and then kind of tracking their performance. So to answer your question, I would think you would want to put some contracts in place with the vendors for those raw materials. Okay. Then the next one on inventory programs for manufacturers of steel items with a large quantity of processes and components. I don't have specific experience with like I don't have any programs to specifically recommend, but I do know that that there's a lot of like I know Sage and even SAP have now made smaller systems where you have that you can use for those specific things. I'm assuming that when you say program, you're referring to the IT system. I know that Sage has a number of processes in place for that, but Yeah, I would, like I said, I'm not intimately familiar with those programs, but I know Sage has something. I don't know if you've tried that or not. Um, so for the market rate or the fair amount to ask for commission on a clothing consignment agreement, that's unfortunately very difficult to say. Mainly, what I would look at is I would look at what other businesses are potentially doing, and then asking and seeing what they feel is a fair rate. I think the fair rate is going to be based on what people are willing to pay for it. So I think the part of that drive will also look at what their actual share is that they make on it. Certain products don't have a high margin. I know, unfortunately, for a lot of clothes and stuff, the margins typically aren't very big. So, but again, but maybe if these are specially made, if they're locally made, if there's certain quality aspects of it that you could charge a higher price for, then there's maybe room for negotiation. But I, if I remember correctly, I think the markup on some clothes is very small. I think it's anywhere in the region of maybe 5 to 10%. So I would imagine, but again, like I said, it's hard to say not knowing what kind of product it is. But I would understand maybe what's the average markup charge on these products, and then saying, well, if the markup is 10%, maybe 3% as part of a consignment stock commission is maybe fair or is not. I think that's where you would want to go through. You want to look and see what's the actual markup on these specific clothing items, and then kind of working from there. Um, so for an inventory management system for small businesses that have a variety of stock for a retail store operating, um, I know, like I said, I'm unfortunately don't have a lot of information on the different systems that's being used, but for retail, the thing that kind of comes to mind is you would want something that can um, seamlessly integrate with your point of sale is probably my recommendation, because you would want to have a system that can manage the inventory but also connect to your sales, so that when you have a sale, that it's able to recognize that and say, well, we've had the sale, we can remove it, and then remove this item. So and again, like I said, I know Sage does do some of that, but in a retail scenario, I would imagine you would want something that connects with your point of sale system, just because it's going to be easier to match the information instead of having that separate. Um, just going back to the one on the steel manufacturing, I know SAP, but the thing is, SAP typically is very expensive. So again, I'm thinking just what's like medium sized um, for that. But I know SAP has been in the past been very good for manufacturing, just because it's able to track the different quantities in the way that you measure. But I guess from that perspective too, is maybe to look and see what suppliers of these products are using, because the reason why I say that is because you might have the option to um, tie back into their system. So, for example, looking and saying, well, who are my suppliers? What systems do they use, and how can I integrate with their systems? Because that might give you a list, or that might start narrowing the list in terms of systems you potentially want to use. Really good questions. I'm sorry that I didn't have all the answers. Is there any other questions? Awesome. Carly, I think I don't see any questions popping up yet, but I mean, if there are any that keep coming, I'm happy to answer them. But otherwise, also feel free to reach out to me by email. Then, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. I also want to thank everyone who was able to join us for today's webinar. You will be able to view this webinar on demand by the end of the day today on our website if you want to rewatch it. And our next upcoming webinar is next Wednesday, and the topic for that is using video to sell your brand and sell for your brand. Registration for that is now open. Goodbye, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.